Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is a 1974 nonfiction narrative book by American author Annie Dillard. Told from a first-person point of view, the book details an unnamed narrator's explorations near her home and various contemplations on nature and life. The title refers to Tinker Creek, which is outside Roanoke in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. Dillard began writing Pilgrim in the spring of 1973, using her personal journals as inspiration. Separated into 4 sections that signify each of the seasons, the narrative takes place over the period of 1 year. The book records the narrator's thoughts on solitude, writing, and religion, as well as scientific observations on the flora and fauna she encounters. Touching upon themes of faith, nature, and awareness, Pilgrim is also noted for its study of theodicy and the inherent cruelty of the natural world. The author has described it as a book of theology, and she rejects the label of nature writer. Dillard considers the story a single, sustained nonfiction narrative, although several chapters have been anthologized separately in magazines and other publications. The book is analogous in design and genre to Henry David Thoreau's Walden 1854, the subject of Dillard's master's thesis at Hollins College. Critics often compare Dillard to authors from the Transcendentalist movement. Edward Abbey in particular deemed her Thoreau's true heir. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek was published by Harper's Magazine Press shortly after Dillard's first book, a volume of poetry titled Tickets for a Prayer Wheel. Since its initial publication, Pilgrim has been lauded by critics. It won the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction, and in 1998 it was included in Modern Library's list of 100 best nonfiction books. Background and publication. Dillard, the daughter of an oil company executive, grew up in an upper-middle-class home in Pittsburgh. She read voraciously. One of her favorite books was Anne Haven Morgan's The Field Book of Ponds and Streams, which she compared to the Book of Common Prayer in painstaking detail. It instructed on the study and collection of plants and insects. She attended Hollins College in Roanoke County, Virginia, receiving both a bachelor's 1967 and a master's degree 1968. At Hollins, she came under the tutelage of poet and creative writing professor Richard Henry Wilde Dillard, whom she married in 1965. She would later state that Richard taught her everything she knew about writing. Her master's thesis, Walden Pond and Thoreau, studied the eponymous pond as a structuring device for Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Dillard's knowledge of Thoreau's works was an obvious inspiration, although critics have pointed to many differences between their 2 works. However, in a nod to his influence, Dillard mentions within the text that she named her goldfish Ellery Channing, after one of Thoreau's closest friends. After graduating in 1968, she continued to live in Virginia near the Blue Ridge Mountains, where she wrote full-time. At first, she concentrated solely on poetry, which she had written and published when she was an undergraduate. She began keeping a journal in 1970, in which she recorded her daily walks around Tinker Creek. Her journals would eventually consist of 20 volumes. In 1971, after suffering from a serious bout of pneumonia, she decided to write a full-length book dedicated to her nature writings. Dillard wrote the first half of Pilgrim at her home in spring 1973, and the remaining half the following summer in a study carrel that overlooked a tar and gravel roof at the Hollins College library. She would later explain her choice of writing location as stemming from her wanting to avoid appealing workplaces. When one wants a room with no view so imagination can meet memory in the dark. Dillard's primary reader for Pilgrim was a Hollins professor called John Reesmore. After finishing a chapter, she would bring it to Moore to critique. Moore specifically recommended that she expand the book's first chapter to make clear and to state boldly what it was she was up to, a suggestion that Dillard at first dismissed, but would later admit was good advice. Previous to publication, chapters of the book appeared in publications including Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, and The Living Wilderness. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek was published by Harper's Magazine Press in 1974 and was dedicated to Dillard's husband. Editor-in-Chief Larry Fundlich remarked upon first reading the book, "I never expected to see a manuscript this good in my life. The chance to publish a book like this is what publishers are here for." Summary. Written in a series of internal monologues and reflections, the book is told from the perspective of an unnamed narrator who lives next to Tinker Creek, in the Blue Ridge Mountains near Roanoke, Virginia. Over the course of a year, the narrator observes and reflects upon the changing of the seasons as well as the flora and fauna near her home. Pilgrim is thematically divided into 4 sections, one for each season consisting of separate named chapters: heaven and earth in jest, seeing, winter, the fixed, the not, the present, spring, intricacy. The first chapter, Heaven and Earth in Jest, serves as an introduction to the book. The narrator describes the location as well as her connection to it. "I live by a creek, Tinker Creek, in a valley in Virginia's Blue Ridge. An anchorite's hermitage is called an anchor hold. Some anchor holds were simple sheds clamped to the side of a church, like a barnacle or a rock. I think of this house clamped to the side of Tinker Creek as an anchor hold. It holds me at anchor to the rock bottom of the creek itself and keeps me steadied in the current, as a sea anchor does, facing the stream of light pouring down. It's a good place to live. There's a lot to think about." In the afterword of the 1999 Harper Perennial Modern Classics edition, Dillard states that the book's other 2-part structure mirrors the 2 routes to God according to Neoplatonic Christianity, the via positiva and the via negativa. The first half of the book, the via positiva, beginning with the 2nd chapter, accumulates the world's goodness and God's. The second half, the via negativa, ends with the chapter Northing, which Dillard notes is the counterpart of the 2nd chapter. The first and last chapters of the book serve as the introduction and conclusion, respectively. The narrative is composed of vignettes detailing the narrator's wanderings around the creek. In the present, the narrator encounters a puppy at a gas station off the highway and pats its belly while contemplating the view of the nearby mountain range. The reflective act of petting the puppy is referred to in several other chapters. In Stalking, the narrator pursues a group of muskrats in the creek during summer. One of the most famous passages comes from the beginning of the book, when the narrator witnesses a frog being drained and devoured by a water beetle. Style and genre. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is a work of creative nonfiction that uses poetic devices such as metaphor, repetition, and inversion to convey the importance of recurrent themes. Although it is often described as a series of essays, Dillard has insisted it is a continuous work, as evidenced by references to events from previous chapters. Although the chapters are separately named, several have also been published separately in magazines and anthologies. She referred to the book in a 1989 interview as a single sustained nonfiction narrative. Dillard has also resisted the label of nature writer, especially in regard to Pilgrim. She stated, "There's usually a bit of nature in what I write, but I don't consider myself a nature writer." The book often quotes and alludes to Walden, although Dillard does not explicitly state her interest in Thoreau's work. Critic Donna Mendelsohn notes that Thoreau's presence is so potent in her book that Dillard can borrow from him both straightforwardly and also humorously. Although the 2 works are often compared, Pilgrim does not comment upon the social world as Walden does. Rather, it is completely rooted in observations of the natural world. Unlike Thoreau, Dillard does not make connections between the history of social and natural aspects, nor does she believe in an ordered universe. Whereas Thoreau refers to the machine-like universe in which the creator is akin to a master watchmaker, Dillard recognizes the imperfection of creation, in which something is everywhere and always amiss. In her review for the New York Times, Eudora Welty noted Pilgrim's narrator being the only person in Dillard's book, substantially the only one in her world. Speaking of the universe very often, she is yet self-surrounded. Dillard seemingly refers to the idea of an invisible narrator in the 6th chapter of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, while referring to the infinite power of God, the narrator notes that invisibility is the all-time great cover, 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 great cover. Nancy C. Parrish, author of the 1998 book Lee Smith, Annie Dillard, and the Hollins Group, A Genesis of Writers, notes that despite its having been written in the first person, Pilgrim is not necessarily autobiographical. The narrator, Annie Dillard, therefore becomes a persona through which the author can experience and describe thoughts and events that the real Annie Dillard had only heard about or studied or imagined. Critic Susan Clarke also points to the peculiar evasiveness of Dillard the author, noting that when we read Annie Dillard, we don't know who is writing. There is a silence in the place where there might be an image of the social self of personality, character, or ego. While most critics assume that the narrator is female, mostly due to the autobiographical elements of the book and the assumption that the narrator is Dillard herself, Clarke questions whether the narrator is male. Stating that Dillard uses a variety of male voices, male styles throughout the book, Clarke asks, when Dillard quit writing Pilgrim at Tinker Creek in the persona of a 50-year-old man, did she then begin to write as a woman? Themes: religion and nature. Pilgrim is often noted for its study of theodicy, or its defense of God's goodness in the face of evil. The narrator attempts to reconcile the harsh natural world, with its seemingly horrid mortality, with the belief in a benevolent God. Death is repeatedly mentioned as a natural, although cruel progression, evolution. The narrator states, "Loves death more than it loves you or me." A passage in the second chapter of the book describes a frog being sucked dry by a giant water bug as the narrator watches. This necessary cruelty shows order in life and death. The narrator especially sees inherent cruelty in the insect world. Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly. The narrator states, "I had thought to live by the side of the creek in order to shape my life to its free flow, but I seem to have reached a point where I must draw the line. It looks as though the creek is not buoying me up, but dragging me down." The title of the book suggests a pilgrimage, and yet the narrator does not stray far from her home near the creek. The journey is metaphysical. Margaret Lowen Reamer, in one of the first critical studies based on the book, noted that Dillard's treatment of the metaphysical is similar to that of Herman Melville. While Melville's eyes saw mainly the darkness and the horror of the natural world, possibly stemming from his New England Puritan roots, Dillard's sinister vision of the world comes more from a horror at the seeming mindlessness of nature's design than from a deeply pervasive sense of evil. Unlike Melville, however, Dillard does not moralize the natural world or seek to find paradise. The Pilgrim narrator seeks to behold the sacred, which she dedicates herself to finding either by stalking or seeing. At one point, she sees a cedar tree near her house charged and transfigured, each cell buzzing with flame as the light hits it. This burning vision, reminiscent of creation's holy fire, comes and goes, mostly goes, but I live for it. Critic Jenny Emery Davidson believes that Dillard's act of stalking allows her to rewrite the hunting myth, a popular although long tradition of male nature writers including James Fenimore Cooper, Jack London, and Richard Nelson have used this theme as a symbolic ritual of violence. Dillard ventures into the terrain of the hunt, employing its rhetoric while also challenging its conventions. Seeing and awareness. While some critics describe Pilgrim at Tinker Creek as being more devoted to speculation of the divine and natural world than to self-exploration, others approach the work in terms of Dillard's attention to self-aware analysis. For example, critic Mary Davidson McConaughey points to Dillard's Thoreauvian commitment to awareness. In the book, the narrator is not only self-aware, but also alert to every detail around her. Pilgrim's second chapter defines two types of seeing, as verbalization active and as a letting go passive. The narrator refers to the difference between the two methods as the difference between walking with and without a camera. Whereas the former requires the need to analyze and pry, the latter only requires rapt attention. The act of seeing is exhaustive and exhausting. As one of the chapters relates, I look at the water, minnows and shiners. If I am thinking minnows, a carp will fill my brain till I scream. I look at the water's surface, skaters, bubbles, and leaves sliding down. Suddenly my own face, reflected, startles me witless. Though reception and awards,